good evening and welcome to Ratio Christi, and it's good to be back with you. And we welcome all of you who are going to be joining us on YouTube this evening. Ratio Christi is a student campus ministry. It's a global or international organization. It currently has 5 chapters at the universities in South Africa, Stellenbosch, Rhodes, Pretoria, Northwest, and UKZN Maritzburg campus. We exist to serve Christian students on campus, to help them better understand the Christian faith, giving historical, philosophical, and scientific arguments and reasons for the Christian faith, in order that Christians can better understand what they believe and why they believe what they believe, but also to improve our conversations with others who don't share the Christian worldview, and then to be more efficient in our conversations in terms of sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with them. This is at the heart of Ratio Christi. We're an evangelistic organization, serious about the Christian message, and we are delighted that you can join us this evening. We do have a website here in South Africa, so do take a look at that, ratiochristi.co.za, and we do have some free resources on there, and you can also sign up on our website as well. And do also take the time to follow us on our YouTube channel, which has a growing library of interviews with scholars and experts from all over the world on all kinds of issues, on theology and Bible and history, apologetics, philosophy, and as we tackle many of the popular issues and many of the contentious issues in the culture today. And so do feel free to join us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel. And since we are a campus ministry, I'll do the financial pitch as well. For those of you who feel led to support us, we would appreciate any support, whether that is through prayer, recommendations, or also financial support as well. So we just ask that you might consider that. This evening, our guest scholar is Dr. Steve Miller, who is coming to us from the USA. He is a professor of philosophy, associate professor of philosophy at Kennesaw State University, which is the second largest university in Georgia. He teaches classes on the introduction to religion, death and dying, and critical thinking. Regarding apologetics, he's written on the existence of God, near-death experiences, deathbed experiences, and also he's done a critique of Richard Dawkins's The God Delusion. His book, Near-Death Experiences as Evidence for the Existence of God and Heaven, has been translated into several languages, including German, a German edition by a subsidiary of Random House. And so this evening, it's my honor and privilege to welcome Steve. Steve, thank you so much for joining us here in South Africa.
Thank you. It's great to be here. You want me to go ahead and start the PowerPoint?
No, let me just do a little bit of intro, and then we can get that ready. But you've written on a few different things. But this evening, we've asked Dr. Miller to tackle the question of near-death experiences, or NDEs, as it's sometimes referred to. And so what Dr. Miller is going to do for us this evening, he's going to do a PowerPoint presentation for us. And following that lecture or talk, we're then going to go to a Q&A session where I will be tackling Dr. Miller with a number of questions. And you feel free, those of you on YouTube, to post your questions in the chat box. We'll pick those up. Those will be sent through to me. And from there, I'll be able to fire them across to Dr. Miller, and he can tackle them from us. So if you can share your screen now, Dr. Miller, and dive into your talk, that's all good to go now.
All right, let's see how quickly the electrons are working today. There we go. Can you see it?
That's good. Yes.
Okay, it's not giving me the page number, so bear with me for a minute. I've got near-death and deathbed experiences here on one PowerPoint, which if any of you want, I can leave with you. So let's see. Okay, so let me start off by saying I appreciate so much Ratio Christi and what you guys are doing, because when I was growing up, I became a believer as a sophomore in high school. I went on a retreat because a girl I liked was going, which is the way God apparently works to get a lot of guys on track, and became a very dedicated believer. But soon after becoming a believer, I began questioning my faith. Whenever I would hear questions attacks on the faith, a lot of my friends never seemed to have a problem with it, but I would begin questioning. And the only way I could resolve my faith was to go in and study both sides of the issues. What are the attackers saying? What are Christians saying in response? And I would work them through. I would come to a better place in my faith. And then I would come up with other questions. And I just have a questioning nature that has to get to the bottom of things. So I studied apologetics. I went to Christian universities, to non-Christian, University of Georgia, tried to take the courses that I thought would be the most difficult for Christians to answer, so that I'd make sure I was understanding the other side, and eventually came back to my a stronger faith because of it. So what Ratio Christi is doing, both for Christians who are questioners like me and for unbelievers who are in seeking mode, is to expose us to these things. So in my own life, I've needed this, and that's why I've been so passionate about it my whole life. But I was never told anything in all my studies. I went to 3 undergraduate schools, 2 different graduate schools, studied theology, studied a lot of courses, pro and con, but I was never taught anything about near-death experiences, interestingly enough, until about 10 years ago. A relative wanted me to read the little book, Heaven is for Real, which a movie was made out of. And I wasn't excited about reading it. I did it as a favor, and I read it. And I thought, okay, this little boy had a near-death experience during an illness. And he claims that all these things happen. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but how can I know? It's just his testimony. And they made a lot of money off of it, probably. So how can I trust it? But on the book was a little blurb by a doctor who said, I've studied these for years, and this testimony is consistent with what I'm seeing in my studies. And I thought, people are studying this? So I think what often most people have seen is they've seen little books written for a popular crowd. They've seen testimonies in the internet, but they never went back to see what kind of study had been done on near-death experiences. And this was quite astounding for me. So what I'm going to share with you here are some of the history of near-death experiences, why I think they're very useful for Christians, and why secular people who I've often thought like you, why they need to seriously think about these things. Let me see if I can take another step in technology here and actually go into this link and see if you can hear this when I do this. Can y'all hear this?
At the moment, no, I can't hear anything at the moment.
Okay, let's see if it comes on. Can you see it?
No, at the moment we just got a PowerPoint there on what happens when you die. That's all I can see at the moment.
Okay, we'll just stop this and I'll tell you what you would have seen had you been able to see that. Let me go back to my PowerPoint. New share. Let's do a new share. We'll go to here. I'm so sorry for this. Let me get back to my screen share. So maybe we have to do a new share, get back to the PowerPoint. Okay, I think I need to close these on my end. And well, now I'm completely off. Can you see me?
I can.
Okay. Let me hit the new share one more time. Well, now I'm completely off. I think I'm going to have to join the meeting once more, unless you have a better way for me to get on. Okay. Okay. So here we are, near-death experiences. Let me get started with what you would have seen had that worked. You can still click through to that. Now I'm on a different page, so I'm going back to my original page. But what I was showing you is something that happened just a couple of years ago. we had a conference in New York City by a first-class organization, New York Academy of Sciences, 20,000 plus members in 100 countries. And in November 2019, they got these experts together on resuscitation. This is a totally secular meeting. Okay, the moderator is Sam Parnia, MD, PhD, Director of Critical Care and Resuscitation Research at New York University School of Medicine. The panelists, so they're giving the latest and greatest on resuscitation and what's happening in medicine to medical people. The panelists that he's interviewing, one of them is Dr. Tom Offerhide, who is a recognized researcher in emergency cardiac care at the Medical College of Wisconsin. He asked this doctor, tell me about some of these experiences when people die. The doctor says, well, I had a most interesting experience when I was first a resident. The person who was supposed to be overseeing me in my residency said, hey, I'm really tired. I'm going to go take a nap. You just take over. And somebody had a cardiac arrest. He went in to try to help. Everyone was resuscitating the person, and the person kept dying, being resuscitated, dying, resuscitated. Finally, he resuscitates him, and he stays resuscitated. Now, later, the person was in the hospital for weeks. He was in serious condition. Then the doctor comes back in and is going to release him. The guy says, you're the only person who's been consistent with me here. I want to tell you something. You need to hear this. And he said, okay, fine. And he said, when I was supposed to have been clinically dead, when my heart had stopped, my resuscitation had, I had not been resuscitated, no breathing, no heart. I knew what was going on. In fact, I knew what was going on in your mind. And the doctor said, well, tell me about this. He said, well, I remember you walking out in the hall and talking to my wife. And frankly, you weren't very positive about my situation. Then my lunch was sitting there and you ate my lunch because you didn't think I was going to get better. That was pretty down problem. And then after that, he says, and during this time, I had a life review. I had all these wild things happen. He said, and I could, in your mind, I could hear what you were thinking. Again, this is just a secular conference. And he said, you were feeling sorry for yourself because the person over you had left you in charge and this happened. Now, the doctor said afterwards, he said, now I could rationalize many of the things that this person said. Okay, maybe he overheard some of the things in the hallway. Maybe somebody told him later about certain things. But when he told me what I was thinking, that got my attention. How could he have known that? So to him, this first near-death experience that he saw had evidence that there was something going on. The brain was working, or the mind was working outside of the brain. How could this be? And so he said, he talked to his patient. He said, well, did you talk to your pastor? He said, well, yes, I did, but I got halfway through it. And the pastor said, this isn't in the Bible, and left. And the doctor said, well, I'll go talk to a psychiatrist. So he's talked to the spiritual counselor. Now he goes to talk to another counselor, the psychiatrist. And he says, there's, he told the psychiatrist what happened. And then the psychiatrist said, got halfway through talking to him. And he said, this is crazy, and hung up on me. Now, there's several fascinating things about this, and you really ought to watch this starting where I showed it, because this is a very important conference, very important specialists in resuscitation, secular conference, and they're talking about near-death experiences, how they happen, what do we make of these? And the spiritual counselor in the case, I think, failed. He just blankly said, I've never heard of these before, and didn't talk to the person. I don't think we can do that as believers. We need to talk to these people and not assume they're of the devil or assume this is something secular in nature. We need to learn about them. We need to have the humility to talk to people who've had these experiences. Secondly, the secular counselor had no right to tell them this was crazy. I really believe that through the 1900s, naturalism has become so strong that we've been afraid to talk about the spiritual experiences all around us, which seem very real to people, and we need to have some kind of answers. Even if you're not a counselor, even if you're not a pastor, you need to be able to talk about these things because your friends are having these experiences. So let me tell you how this study got started. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross moved to America and began working in a hospital. And she realized that people who were dying were not treated very well. So she became an expert in the dying. She wrote a very influential book called On Death and Dying. And she began to talk about these experiences people were having at death and how they seemed to indicate an afterlife. Later, Raymond Moody grew up in a secular family. His dad was an atheist and was a surgeon. His dad came home one day and after a surgery where he had a person opened up, the person had died, and he said he massaged the person's heart and it started beating. Well, little Raymond, as a kid, asked, okay, Dad, well, what did he say happened while he was dead? What was it like? And his dad said, well, of course nothing happened. He was dead. You don't have any consciousness when you're dead. So Moody grew up in a secular household, went to the University of Virginia, and began studying philosophy. Along the way, he took a graduate course, an honors class, where they were studying Plato and his famous Republic. In the Republic, Plato's talking to a person, or he's giving an illustration of a soldier named E-R. You can read of it. And at the end of this famous work by Plato, the Republic, he gives this person's experience who died. And during his death, he had this vision of an afterlife, heaven and hell. So Moody's reading this, and he expresses a fascination to his teacher. He said, I have great respect for Plato. Tell me about this experience. And the professor says, well, there's a psychiatrist on campus that you need to meet. His name is George Ritchie, very respected psychiatrist. He had an experience like that. And Moody thought, somebody's had that experience today. This is incredible. You ought to read this book. It's a little book. It's old now. You can get it for probably 99 cents on Amazon. But this person was going to the army. He was at the age of 20, and he got sicker and sicker in the hospital, eventually died, and he went to the other side, and God asked him questions. He said, I saw Jesus. They asked me, what have you done with your life? And he said, oh, well, I was a scout. I did all these great things. And they said, well, no, what did you do for me? And when he came back from that, in fact, when he was sharing at a meeting that Moody attended, Ritchie passed around his death certificate for everyone to see. This person's life was changed forever because of that experience. So this would be a good book for you to read to introduce you to near-death experiences. Moody wrote a book called Life After Life in about 1975, just talking about the experiences. By the way, Moody remained pretty secular through most of his life on, do these really imply an afterlife or not? I talked to Moody one day, and he said, the reason I did that was because as a philosopher, I kind of felt like if I came to a conclusion, I'd stop searching. But later in his life, he studied these his whole life. And he said, yes, I finally, people are coming out of their bodies and they're experiencing an afterlife. So enter Michael Sabone, who is a cardiologist in Atlanta, not only your general cardiologist next door, he's a professor of cardiology at Emory University, which is a respected medical university. And somebody was speaking on Moody's work, and they said, oh, I see we have Michael Sabone here. What do you have to say about this? And he said, the nicest thing I could think to say was, I don't believe it. And the nurse who was presenting said, well, Dr. Sabone, please, why don't you talk to some of your patients? He said, oh, none of them had an experience like this. She said, well, just talk to them. I'd like to talk to you about it. He began interviewing his patients and found out many of them, when they had flatlined, came back talking about very vivid experiences they were having. So he decided, well, I'm going to do a study and get to the bottom of this. He thought that his study would show that these are not real, that they're just people's ideas of what happened to them because of what they've seen on TV. But what he did very scientifically, the only ones that would want to read this book this book are the ones who really want to get into the science of it because he's very detailed. So he did a study where he had one subset of his patients who had, during the resuscitation, they actually said they came out of their bodies and experienced a near-death experience. Then he had another set of patients who did not have a near-death experience and they were resuscitated. Okay. So he compared the two and he asked the ones who had had the near-death experience, what happened to you during your resuscitation? The ones who had had a near-death experience always got the details right. And he said, all these are done a little bit differently. It's not like on TV where they do the same thing every time. Then when he interviewed the people who had not had a near-death experience, had not seen it outside of their bodies, he said, those people always got it wrong, the ones who had not had a near-death experience. His conclusion after about a year of study was these people are coming out of their bodies. That's the only explanation I have. Now, Sabom earlier was kind of a liberal semi-believer. After he did this study, he became a believer and got involved in a pretty conservative church. I don't know what conservative means over there, but I mean kind of a historic Christian church that actually believed the fundamentals of the faith, and that's where he is to this day. Then enter Pim van Lommel, cardiologist from the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, probably most people would say there's not an afterlife. And he experienced the same thing. He was a young intern, I believe, or was just starting out. Somebody on his hall had all the alarms went off. Nurses rush in, they resuscitate this patient, and everybody's excited in the room except one person, the patient. The patient was peeved off because he had been in a land of perfection, and now he had to be back in this body. Pim van Lommel says, what's happening here? He said, I know from my secular research. He said, I'm a reductionist. I believe everything reduces down to natural causes. What could have caused this person to have this vivid memory of something that happened while his heart had stopped and while he had no respiration? So he goes on and does a big study, and it was actually published in one of the most respected medical journals out there on near-death experiences and what he found. His conclusion, people were really coming out of their bodies. They're experiencing something of the afterlife, something of the other side. And interestingly enough, again, these are not Christians. That are starting this. They're people who tend to start off secular, and they're just brought over by the weight of the evidence from studying them. Then enter Eben Alexander. Some people who studied neurology would say, oh, there's a neurological explanation. He was a neurologist at Harvard University, one of the most respected universities in the world. He had his own near-death experience and wrote about it in Proof of Heaven, which became an international bestseller. Now, I would just say one reason that we as believers need to study these is because these books have been bestsellers, videos are out there, people discuss them, and even your non-Christian friends and your atheist friends have often had similar experiences that they're trying to explain in their minds. So I think we need to be familiar with this. So what kind of research had been done? This is what I was unaware of. Over 900 articles on near-death experiences were published in scholarly literature prior to 2005, gracing the pages of Psychiatry, The Lancet. Pim van Lommel, he published in The Lancet, Critical Care Quarterly, all these journals. That's what I began to research to see what are the people at our best universities, our top experts, what are they saying about near-death experiences? That was the basis of the book I ended up writing on near-death experience. In the 30-year period after Moody published Life After Death, 55 researchers or teams published at least 65 studies of over 3,500 near-death experiences. What happens in a near-death experience? Now, as I'm saying all this, don't try to write all this down. This will be there in the video. Write down any questions you have. If you say, this isn't biblical, I don't believe it's biblical because of this verse, jot it down. If you think, well, this can be explained naturalistically, write it down. I'm not afraid of your questions. If I don't know the answer, I'll say, I don't know. But typically, most of these things I've studied out, and I'd like to help you along the way in the question and answer time. But the typical content of the experience: a person will have a cardiac arrest. She finds herself in a timeless dimension, looking down at her lifeless body and a team of doctors, nurses, and she may look down for a while before she discovers, wow, that's my body down there. Where am I? Then she may go through a tunnel, conversing with angels, deceased relatives in a timeless dimension. It's almost always deceased relatives. Think about it, your dreams, and when people have hallucinations, it's not typically deceased relatives. If you take DMT, you're not talking to deceased relatives. You're often talking to aliens and others. Hallucinations wildly differ from one another. But why is there a pattern if this is totally naturalistic? Then she may see beautiful landscapes of colors, more beautiful than she's ever seen. The being of light that they describe is often identified as God. This being reviews her life. Doesn't happen every time, but these are typical things that happen. Sometimes they'll say in the brief minutes that they're out of it, they may say they've viewed their entire life, which is quite amazing. How do you get all that compressed in that time period unless they're in a place that's perhaps devoid of time and space? She talks to an angel and decides to return to Earth for the sake of the family and friends. They often have a discussion about coming back. She returns to the body to the delight of the resuscitation team. Years later, interviews find that her story remains the same and her life has changed. A lot of objectors will say, oh, well, people just, over the years, they've added to these. And but what the cardiologists have done is to interview them close to their experience. And then Van Lommel introduced them at like 5-year periods to see if their story changed. It didn't. People I know that have had near-death experiences, they can tell you years later, they'll say, I can see the whole thing in my mind. And they can just go through the whole thing with you. They'll say it does not change. So let's be scientific. What hypotheses might explain near-death experiences? And which hypothesis best fits the data? What we're trying to do is what scientists do when they infer to the best explanation. So light up your theological or philosophical pipe here and just smoke on this for a while, okay? I'm speaking in metaphors. I don't really smoke, but here we go. We're going to smoke on this for a minute. The naturalistic hypothesis, the two main going hypotheses are that it's something purely naturalistic or this is something spiritual that's happening. So the naturalistic hypothesis would say, hey, the mind doesn't exist apart from the brain. And they'll give all kind of evidence for this, like, okay, give me something that's a mental event that can't be explained by the brain. And you'll have a hard time because when you, so many things today, you can say, oh, well, that was the brain doing that. I had a vivid dream. Okay, but the brain can produce dreams. Okay, well, I thought I saw a deceased relative. Well, your brain can make you think you're seeing a deceased relative. But actually, if you think about it, this whole area of near-death and deathbed experiences does give data that's not consistent with the brain being the same thing as the mind, because it gives evidence that certain things are going on while the brain is at least, it might be shut down. It should be shut down. But even if it has any activity during clinical death, it's very minor. And they're coming back with great, vivid experiences that they report that are remembered. Also, they'll say you can't be 100% certain there's not a natural explanation. Well, sure. Now I'm a philosopher, and I'd say I'm 100% certain philosophically about very few things. I believe I exist, because if I doubt my existence, according to Descartes, which I think he's right, well, it's got to be me that's doing the doubting. Now, you get beyond that and you say, am I really interviewing with you guys now? Am I sitting in my mother's house? I take care of my mother who's elderly. Am I doing this? Well, I can't be 100% sure, because maybe I'm in a matrix. Maybe somebody's fooling with my brain. Maybe I just think it's happening. So most of the things I believe a certain percent, 98% or 95% on things. That's the way scientists are, because science is empirical. So if they say, can you be 100% sure there's not a natural explanation? I say, well, no, we can be 100% certain of very little, but we can't just assume there will be a naturalistic explanation, because that would be naturalism of the gaps, where we just fill in anything that looks supernatural with naturalism. And scientists would say that doing that is not really science, because there's no way to deny it. You know, if you're going to take everything that seems supernatural and say that'll eventually be explained naturally, then there's no way to make a case for either way. We want to have two hypotheses and see where the facts best fit. Some report experiences years after the experience. They'll say, yes, that's true. But other times, the cardiologists and people are reporting them right after they happen. And again, they review them at 5-year intervals often. Researchers were already biased. No, most of these researchers that I've read were people who were more biased toward a naturalistic explanation until they began studying these experiences. Naturalists will say people are psychologically expecting such an experience. Well, I don't think hardly any are expecting this experience. Especially Christians, we're not expecting a near-death experience if we're about to die. We're expecting a final death experience if we die. We're not expecting at death to all of a sudden look down and see our dead body, talk to some deceased relatives, go through a tunnel and all these things, particularly when Moody was studying these people, because nobody had experienced them. Okay, nobody had heard of near-death experiences. So what we as Christians, I believe, are thinking we're experiencing is something like the thief on the cross. Today you will be with me in paradise. We're going to be with the Lord. If we've got some kind of secular ideas mixed in, we may think we're going to be standing in line outside to meet God and see if we got in, or see what our rewards are. Or we might have the idea of Stephen, who was martyred in the book of Acts, who looked up and saw the throne room of God. Christians aren't expecting this. Non-believers who had these experiences are expecting a boring nothingness. Naturalists, atheists, they're not expecting this. Why would they have it? So it is not what people are expecting. Oxygen deprivation causes a DMT ketamine type substance to secrete in the brain that causes hallucination. Been a lot of studies on this, and those are just very different experiences and very varied that happen with oxygen deprivation. The best way to get at this intellectually, if you're studying this, is to go look at not just the studies themselves, but the meta-analyses of studies, the studies that try to pull together the research from all the studies. This one on the left, the Science of Near-Death Experiences. This is actually a secular organization, I believe, from Missouri, a medical organization that put these together. The one on the right, the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences, 30 years of investigation. And they'll just say right out things like oxygen deprivation, hallucinations. This does not explain the near-death experience. When I see atheists arguing against near-death experiences, they'll inevitably say oxygen deprivation, they'll say hallucinations, but they'll never go in and see the studies that have been done to bring together the studies. And that's a part of what I've tried to do in my book on near-death experiences. So then the afterlife hypothesis. That was the naturalistic hypothesis. I think their hypothesis fails to deal with the data. The afterlife hypothesis says that near-death experiencers often report things they shouldn't have been able to see. Okay, that's what Dr. Sabom found. They were actually reporting accurately from above their bodies what was happening in their resuscitation, where the other group that did not have a near-death experience was not doing it. How did they do that? Well, this seems more consistent with the fact that there really is an afterlife and they were on the other side. In number two, enhanced mental functions are reported when their brains were severely compromised. Eben Alexander, the one from Harvard University, the neurologist, that's what he keeps repeating to people. He say, I know something about brains. My brain should not have been functioning, but I had enhanced mental functions at a time when my brain should have been shut down. That's more consistent with the afterlife hypothesis. We would not expect under naturalism a remarkably consistent experience if it were a psychologically induced dream state or hallucination. Why do they interview people in India and it's much the same experience as over here when we have very different worldviews? Why, if it's a hallucination, would there be any consistency at all? It's a remarkably consistent experience. Number 4, if expectations cause the content, why do so many consistent elements come totally unexpected? By the way, let me mention the Pam Reynolds case. This is another one. Jot it down if you can. Pam Reynolds, there was a television documentary on her, and hers was kind of a special case that Sabom actually researched. Pam Reynolds underwent a risky brain surgery. I'll just read this out of my book to get it right. That required lowering her body temperature to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, draining all the blood from her head by 3 primary tests: a silent EEG, an unresponsive brain stem, and no blood flow to the brain. She's clinically dead. Yet, after the surgery, the patient reports that she was very much alive during the surgery, viewing the procedure from outside her body. She described in accurate detail a conversation that transpired during the surgery and the specialized instruments used by the surgeons. One of the instruments, they talked about a saw, but it looked more like a toothbrush, and she described it. Dr. Sabom at Emory said, I've never heard of this instrument, so I sent off to the manufacturer to see a picture of it, and sure enough, it was the way Pam Reynolds had described it. But she was out of it. Her brain was not working, okay? She described it in accurate detail. Even if her vivid, conscious, out-of-body experience took place prior to the draining of her blood, her eyes were taped shut, she was deeply anesthetized, and 100 decibel clicks assaulted her ears over 10 times per second to monitor her brainstem activity. Except for the small surgical area on her head, her entire body was covered. So, how are they seeing things when their brain's shut down and they shouldn't be able to see it? This is interesting. They don't end abruptly when they regain consciousness. Now, I've tracked my dreams for a while, and my dreams are unmitigated nonsense, I'll tell you right now. And but I track my dreams. I'll wake up in the morning, and inevitably I'll wake up in the middle of a conversation or in the middle of a story. Track your dreams and see this. If these were naturalistic, you would assume that whatever story they were seeing would stop mid-sentence, stop mid-story right when they're resuscitated, because they don't know when they're going to be resuscitated, right? And yet, I've never heard an NDE, and I've probably looked at thousands of them. I've never seen one where it stopped mid-story. There was usually closure in the sense of either an angelic being or Jesus or God, the being of light, is having a conversation about whether you should stay on the other side or come back, and the decision is made either by you or the being you're talking to that you should go back, then you go back. This has all the hallmarks of something that's produced like a movie. You watch a romantic comedy, okay? Boy meets girl, they fall in love, death of a vision, they hate each other, then they get back together, and then it ends up they're together, then it closes. It doesn't stop right in the middle of the relationship somewhere. Why? There's a producer that produced this. I think there's a producer with a capital P. I think that's the best way to explain this experience. None reported a decision to stay before coming back. If this were a hallucination, wouldn't about half the people in this conversation decide to stay, but then they find themselves back? Why is that happening? Children's near-death experiences provide unique evidence. The unique thing about children is that children don't have a well-formulated worldview or theology of the afterlife. So they just kind of tell things like it is. They don't really have expectations typically of death. And yet theirs are consistent with adults. one interesting thing about children is when they speak of angels on the other side, they don't typically have wings. And yet our popular culture says angels should have wings. So if they're expecting what they've seen and come to expect, you'd think the angels would have wings. Very interesting to think about. Deathbed visions provide corroboration. My next book and my PhD dissertation was on deathbed visions. A deathbed vision is when a person has maybe been in hospice for a period of time, they're on the way to dying, and then they start having these visions of deceased relatives and angels before they die. At a recent, at a New York City hospice, it may have just been New York, may have not been the city, might have just been in the state, but doctors studied patients and decided to ask these dying patients daily about their experiences. Over 80% of them were having these vivid dreams or vivid visions of the other side. This was like within the last 5 years. This is an ongoing study, very well done, published in the professional literature. So near-death experiences happen to about 4% of the population. That's 1 out of 25 people. They're all around us. Deathbed visions apparently are happening to about at least 80% of the dying. Maybe they happen to everybody, but just some are so out of it coming to death that they don't experience it. Shared near-death experiences provide multiple eyewitnesses. So I had a relative, a cousin named Bucky, who's smart guy, sharp guy, together guy, taught history all of his life, got a master's degree in history. My mom said, tell him what you're writing on. I said, near-death experiences. He said, oh, I've had 3 of those. I said, are you serious? So he told me about one of them. He said, I was sleeping on my bed one night, about 3 a.m. I felt like a truck had just landed on my chest, like a heart attack, right? I came out of my body. I could see my body down below me. I saw a tunnel out in the corner of the room. I saw some like angelic figures. Then I went back into my body, woke up in a cold sweat. Immediately the phone rang, and it was a nurse from a hospital 90 miles away saying that my dad had just died of a heart attack. His dad had not been sick. He had no expectation that his dad had died. How would that happen at the exact timing unless there's something beyond our brain, our eyes' ability to see this limited, what's going on in this house around me, and my ears' ability to hear? How could you experience something like that at a distance? These have been studied much in depth, and I talk about them in my new book, but that corroborates the others. Face-to-face interviews have a great impact on researchers. The deaf report hearing in their near-death experiences. The blind reports people born blind who've never seen anything. They don't even see black. They don't see anything. They report having a near-death experience where they could see. Mind sight was a book written on that by researchers. The colorblind see colors, and it's extremely convincing to people who experience it. Should I continue 10 more minutes? Do we need to stop? How are we with time?
Oh, you can carry on. This is very interesting, Steve. So if you've got more information, I would like to hear more on these experiences if you have there. So yeah,
okay, let me give about 10 more minutes and I'll close it up. But you think of your questions, let the audience think of their questions, and I'll deal with those as well. Let me just mention on this last one. Some people say, okay, well, it doesn't mean anything that the people are saying that it's not only real, what I experienced, but it's realer than real. Smoke on this one a little bit. Think about it. The reason I know that I'm doing this talk right now rather than sleeping is because this is more vivid to me than when I'm asleep. Okay? These people are claiming over and over and over that when they experienced the near-death experience, it was real. It was realer than real. So this is not some just kind of vague feeling. This is an empirical experience to them with the other side that is at least as real as my experience of consciousness right now. So I talked to my pastor about this, and he said, you need to talk to this minister in our church who's had an experience. He had a septic something going on in his body, kept getting worse and worse. They thought he was going to die. He was out of it. During his time of unconsciousness, he had a vivid experience with two heavenly beings who were talking to him, and they had a conversation and determined that he should come back to live longer and take care of his family or whatever. His job wasn't finished yet. He said, I was laying there, I couldn't even communicate with my family, but I knew I was going to get better. Now, I was sitting across from this guy in office. Number one, I said, do you tell this to anybody? He said, no. You don't even tell people in your, he was like a minister of men. I said, do you even talk to anybody in your ministry about it? He said, no. I said, why? He said, I don't know. People are just very private about it. But I said, well, just how real was that experience? And he said, oh, it was real. And I asked him later, I said, again, just how real was it? Is real is just normal reality? And he said, no, it was real. He said, no. He looked at me, he said, no, it's as real as me sitting across from you talking to you right now. He said, no, it was realer than this. And a chill went down my spine. I thought, okay, what if that was me? I mean, this is a person who is a successful businessman, extremely together person. And I thought, if I had experienced what he had, wouldn't I be saying, yes, it was real? Atheists have experiences like this. They're not expecting it. And yet they'll often say it's realer than real. And then they try to explain that in their framework. So I'm saying that's evidential in the sense that if 1 out of 25 people in our sane population is having this experience, if 80% of the dying are having deathbed experiences and they're saying it's real, I can assume that if I have that experience one day, I'm going to be saying it's real. So why not accept it as a testimony from my future self? Smoke on that one a little bit. I think there's some evidence there. The impact both on students and experiencers. I do teach a class on Intro to Religion. We don't talk about these a lot, but some will choose to read one of my books on it for extra credit. I also talk about it in my death and dying class. But it's not just the experiencers whose lives tend to change. It's the people who study the experiences. This has been studied. People who have studied near-death experiences have been studied, and they find it's a very life-changing study. It motivates us to help and serve others because in our life reviews, we actually experience those times in our lives where we've encouraged others and how it impacted them and how sometimes we said the wrong things and hurt the people we've loved. And we come out of these experiences saying, wow, it doesn't matter how successful my books are or if I make straight A's through college. Those are good things if God wants you to do them. But what really counts is how did I treat my fellow students? How am I treating my little brother or sister? It gives purpose or meaning to life, and it produces seekers of God and truth. Sabom was told later, some people would say, oh, these near-death experiences are of the devil. You shouldn't be studying them. They lead people astray. So he did a study of his patients. Again, this was called the Atlanta study. And he found that the people who had near-death experiences became closer to God. They became more conservative in their faith. Again, in the sense of joining a church that was more with the historic Christian faith of believing in Jesus, their Savior, and whatever. And they prayed more. Penny Sartori found the same thing in her PhD dissertation. And I think since Matthew says you'll know them by their fruits, to me, when I look at the fruit, it's overwhelmingly positive. So why study and use afterlife apologetics? One, there's some of the most compelling evidence for God in heaven. I have a little book that I wrote that gives like 17 lines of evidence for the existence of God in a brief book. I have my students rate them as far as which lines of evidence are the most compelling. Is it the beginning of the universe? Is it the settings of the universe? Is it near-death experiences? Is it answers to prayer? What is the most compelling? Typically, near-death and deathbed experiences are two of the highest related, or the highest rated by my students as being some of the most compelling. Actually, none of these arguments are a dud, according to my students. Some will rate one very high, some will rate another, which is the reason I think we need to have a cumulative apologetic for the faith rather than just relying on one line of evidence that means a lot to us. They're so prevalent that many have either experienced them firsthand or can find them in their circles of trust. In an academic setting, my wife may ask me, like an academic get together of master's students and professors. Sherry will say, hey, tell so-and-so what you're studying, and I'll talk about it. Inevitably, at some point, there'll be a faculty member or someone say, hey, come out here in the hall. I want to talk to you for a while. And they'll tell about their experience, which they may have never told anybody else. These are so widespread that many people will consider the gospel because they're thinking through this experience they had or that they saw someone within their circle of trust have. They're consistent, I believe, with historic Christianity. Look at Paul's trip to the third heaven, out of his body, the transfiguration, what happened with that? Well, we had people from the past who are long dead who are visiting. That's called an after-death communication. Look at Stephen's deathbed vision in the book of Acts. Look at miracles, signs, wonders, dreams. I'm not very much of a dispensationalist. I would say that, yes, I don't see miracles happening to the same extent as they were during Jesus' time. But I think I'm just convinced that some of these things are happening today, and they're very powerful. You know, Jesus said at one time when he healed that man's son, and he said, some people, you know, unless they see signs and wonders, they simply will not believe. Now, maybe that's a niche of people. Maybe it's all people. I don't know. I'm not sure who he was talking to there. But I think what Jesus said holds true today. Some people won't believe unless they see some kind of sign and wonder. And this is a very widespread one. They've been studied extensively by top physicians and academics. People are fascinated with them. My students, many of them have seen the movie Heaven is for Real. They've heard testimonies. So let's use these. People are already fascinated. Let's use them as we talk to people. Both secular and religious people experience them. Mark Twain had a crisis apparition where he saw his brother before he died in a casket. Very interesting. Michael Shermer, the atheist, he experienced an after-death communication. He wrote an article called Infrequencies. He's an atheist, famous atheist, but he had his own experience. They add to the cumulative case. For example, historians are more likely to accept the New Testament documents and the Gospels if they believe that miracles really happen. So if we can show that miracles really happen, then that takes away a roadblock to people who are saying, oh, we can't believe the Gospels because we know miracles don't happen. So to learn more, near-death experiences, that's my book on talking about my research on near-death experiences. Kind of brief. It's a brief introduction, but I think it'll help you. It'll give you other places to read. If you don't have the money, I'll send you a free PDF, okay? I just want to get the word out there. Faith That's Not Blind is the little book of about 17 lines of argument for the existence of God. A brief book that kind of give you an overview of a cumulative case. It's written with my secular students in mind. The book that's coming out probably at the end of this month or next month is Deathbed Experiences. This cover isn't finalized yet, but my designer just gave it to me today. And that will be on the deathbed experience. So, final outcome. This is just something practical for all, a little pastoral, okay? Sports, got the Olympics going on, okay? All that stuff can be important if that's what God wants you to do. Making money, we need to be able to support our families. That can be important. Even pursuing a college degrees, they can be good things. But don't let them blind you to the importance of love. The thing that hits me from near death and deathbed experiences is that God exists. An afterlife exists, number two. Number three, our main things we can do, well, we need to seek God. And that's where I came to the conclusion that Jesus Christ was really the Son of God. I just kept asking questions, read apologetics. I saw it with prayer. I've been seeking all my life. So that's what brought me to Jesus. And finally, about what we do from day to day, the question is, are you showing love? Those are the main things. You don't have to be a great speaker, an author, or pastor, or something to make an impact. If you're going through school, or you just getting A's and you want to graduate top of your class, if God wants you to do that, that's fine. But if that's all you do and you don't help any other students along the way, you don't get any involved in any Christian group to where you can impact others, maybe you're just wasting your life. So love your little brother, your little sister, that irritating person down the hall from you. Those are the things that the life reviews say really count. I think I'll just end right there and read 1 Corinthians 13. That'll be a good reinforcer for this. Thank you so much.
No, thanks very much, Steve. That was fascinating. I've got a number of questions here. We've got a few that have rolled in as well from YouTube. So let us dive into our Q&A session now. But thank you first of all very much for your lecture here. So let me begin with a few confessions, because you said that when you bring the subject up with people, there's some confessions to be had. So I have a few to make myself. I certainly haven't had a near-death experience, but in a close group of family friends of mine, I do have an event that happened to friends of my brothers. And so these are the kinds of guys who I grew up with. And so they got no reason to try and make this up, or, there's nothing to gain from this or anything. But one of my brother's best friends, his dad, died. And afterwards, he came around, and to the shock of the medical staff and all the rest of it. And it kind of was a bizarre event in our lives. These guys are farmers from the East Coast, and they're kind of tough guys. And his dad was dead, and then his son had actually been called to come and identify the body at the morgue. And then the next thing, his dad is up. And so I've never sought to follow up on that. But when I heard that thing, I thought, well, that's really odd and strange. So that's one thing, and I've certainly heard in my own life, my own personal account, which is interesting. But also, I wasn't aware of the extent of these events. That's what struck me. I'll confess. Despite that event in my immediate family and through my brother's good friends, I've always somewhat been skeptical of this kind of thing, because it's quite difficult to know what to make of it. So perhaps you can maybe comment on that, though. I mean, I can understand not just how secular people might be skeptical, but even believers themselves, even though we believe in Jesus and the resurrection, it's just that when people are dying, that it can often be a very traumatic event or a highly stressful event. And, it's difficult to know what to make of that. But what did strike me is the extent of all this research. I was completely unaware of the levels of this. So maybe you can help unpack this for us then,
Sure. I think that in the late 1800s, there were some really very well done studies of deathbed experiences. And they surveyed like 17,000 people around Oxford and Cambridge, around these areas, some very, very well respected people. Their concern was that in the late 1800s, naturalism, reductionistic naturalism, was kind of taking over mainstream science. And they said, no, I don't think we're ready to go there. Yes, we're explaining some things naturalistically that we didn't before, but that doesn't mean there's not a spiritual world out there. Now, these were not Bible-believing Christians necessarily, but there was a spiritualism movement that was trying to understand these experiences people were having, and they decided to study them. Well, what happened was naturalism continued to take over in the sciences to the extent that I think in the 1900s, it was just embarrassing to talk about things like this. People thought you were crazy or unscientific. You couldn't, as a scientist, study them because that's not going to get you the grants. It's not going to get you the respect. And so we just kind of ignored it. So it seems like there's been this thing that's happened when societies that watch people die, or that they're hanging out in their homes and that talk about these things, maybe more in in Africa or in South America, different countries, they may just be all over these things, talking about them very freely. but in especially Europe and the United States, it feels weird. So Lee Strobel, in his most recent book on miracles, he talks about a vision that he had early in life, that was saying something about him going into the ministry or whatever. And he said, I never tell anybody about this vision that I had early in life. He's just kind of afraid of what people might think of it, even talking to other Christians about it. But he said, I think we've become I think that the title of that chapter is Embarrassed by the Supernatural. For some reason, I think naturalism has made cowards of all of us. There are these experiences all around us that are miraculous in nature, but we're afraid to talk about because everybody else is afraid to talk about them. Mm-hmm. And yet they're there in our circles of trust. Like my cousin Bucky, he would have never told me about that had I not brought it up. But that was one of the most significant experiences in his life. So I think we've become embarrassed about the supernatural because of naturalism. And then secondly, all kinds of people write books on their experiences. Some write it probably for money. Some make things up. Some people are not Christians and talk about all kind of way out doctrine that they were so-called told on the other side. But I think just like Jesus said, I mean, you have to, or just like the New Testament talks about, you have to test people in these things. You don't just accept everything you hear. But I think some Christians are afraid to talk about it because so many identify these with something that's like false prophets.
Yeah. I think that's a concern for a lot of us now, because I remember I was actually in the US when that book came out, and you know, it's difficult. It's kind of like dealing with some miraculous accounts to know when there's authentic miracles and when there's, you know, people trying to profit off of the work of God and vulnerable people and all the rest of it. And that's sad. And we know that happens in the church. And so I think that, what do you make of, for example, the book Heaven is for Real, that they made the movie about? I mean, what do you make of those accounts of and experiences of those of books like that?
Well, I mean, there's some marks of authenticity. They seem like a nice family. He seems like a sincere person. Many of the things he says seem good, but you can't draw great conclusions from anecdotal evidence, which I define as, you know, coming from people you don't know, things that fly around over the internet, because we don't know these people. So what if one day little Colton admits, okay, I just made all this up, or we were in dire straits and we made it up? One other boy, Malarkey, interestingly enough, was his name. They actually wrote a book with his dad on it, and then later said, no, it never happened. So the Heaven is for Real, they haven't said that, but I just don't know. I don't have enough evidence to know. I don't know the family. So what I've done is try to stay with the well-done studies of near-death experiences, which do show very dramatic events that I believe are best explained supernaturalistically, but I'm not going to believe everything I hear over the internet, even if it's a doctor sharing it. You know, there are all kind of motives with which people share. Number one, when the Bible is talking about how do we know a false prophet from a real prophet, I'm not saying these people are prophets, but I'm saying this is a good example. Is it consistent with what God's told us before? Is it consistent with what God, if somebody's sharing something that's not consistent with what God said in the past, there's a problem with it. Number two, if they gave some kind of prophecy, do they have any evidence of it being consistent 100% of the time? That was the test of the Old Testament prophets. Another question is the fruit. Jesus talked about, by their fruits you shall know them. And I think Dr. Sabom, for example, I think there's a lot of good fruit that's come from his ministry and his research, whereas sometimes the fruit is just to send people off into error. So I think we have to test these things. We don't accept everything we hear, even if the experience itself is real.
I actually had a personal conversation with a guy when I was staying in the States in North Carolina. He used to keep bees on the farm I used to live on. His name was Pat. And he was a Catholic. He actually gave me his Summa Theologica. He had studied it, but he had become a skeptic over the years. But he was fascinated with the near-death experiences. And he came out the gate one day talking to me about these things. And in the conversations he had with him, he said to him, no, he doesn't believe in the Christian account. And, he says, when you die, God doesn't judge you, and, this kind of thing. And of course, I said to him, well, why would you believe that? He said, well, I've been reading all these books about these accounts and these people have been having. And I said to him, well, fair enough. I said to him, but you just simply adopting these people as an authority on their experiences and taking that out. I said to him, but that's true. Why can't I adopt the authority of Jesus on the issue of death? I mean, Jesus had a death experience, and seems a fairly good person to have as an authority, to have had a death experience and tell us what is going on in the afterlife. I mean, Jesus went through that experience, so Jesus also has a death experience as well. So he wasn't quite sure how to respond to that, because then what it boils down to is, which authority are you going to have to? Because I didn't know much about this field, so I couldn't really navigate. But I kind of used that as my response. But what I wanted to drive at, on top of that, kind of sharing that personal experience and kind of evangelistic encounter with this guy, where I was talking to him. He became a friend of ours, and for me and my wife, and we knew him for a while and visited him. But just talk to me about this consistencies in experience across cultures. That's very interesting to me, that you can have people in such diverse cultures, and this consistency in that experience. Maybe you can unpack that for us, because a lot of people would say, well, this is just you kind of having some kind of, I don't know, psychological event that's couched in your own, experiences, and your brain kind of puts it together in some kind of hallucinatory way. And you go, well, even if that's the case, then one would expect that people of different cultures would then have experience commensurate with that different culture and all those experiences. So I'm very interested in this, in what they're finding in the experiences between cultures. And then maybe on top of that, we can move to this issue of children, because children don't have a lot of baggage coming in on this thing now, and so I'm interested in trying to also look at that as well. So maybe you can just visit that again, because I know you touched on it briefly.
Okay, you said several things there, so let me know if I forget to respond to one of them.
Yeah.
I was watching, I watch TV with my mom when I'm helping her. For the last 25 years, in one way or another, I've been taking care of people in the family who've either been dying or elderly. And I saw an episode of Gunsmoke where Marshall Dillon was getting some testimonies about a murder, and some guy had got shot and was giving a testimony about who really did the murder. And he had a quote, I probably won't quote it exactly right, but he said, dying has a way of pulling the truth out of people. And I think if you think about it, a lot of people, if you're doing a study of individuals who have nothing to gain from this, especially that are dying themselves, like in a deathbed experience, why are they wanting to tell their last big lie? So there's some kind of authenticity. And in fact, in our legal system, they will, whereas some things they would say, oh, well, that's not a good testimony because we don't have the testifier here. They do make a difference in the case of a deathbed testimony for that reason. So I think these are can be very powerful. So as far as the consistency globally, some have said things like some of the early testimonies people brought up in the Far East, for example, they would talk about that people did not go through this tunnel. And so that's a difference in the Western near-death experiences. Well, I went to the NDERF site that a physician, where a physician has collected thousands of near-death experiences from people. I went through several thousand experiences and narrowed down 50 of them that were from very cultures very different from South Africa and the United States and Western Europe. Their religion was different. They tended to believe differently. And I compared those. And I indeed found just as many people in India who were experiencing going through a tunnel. But not everybody experiences going through a tunnel. Even in the United States, they may be going up some stairs or going up It's symbolic. I don't think there really is a tunnel they're going through. I think
Yeah.
God is giving them an experience to say, you're going to another dimension. You're going somewhere. And so there may be a little bit of variety that, but the consistency is they have the experience of going somewhere. The clothing may be different. Now, you would expect that. Some people just see people as kind of very white, bright light. Some people will experience someone who died in the past as being still young. Sometimes they're all grown up. One person that had the experience, the person having the experience saw a deceased relative and said, "Oh, well, I didn't know you would appear so old." The person said, "Well, I can appear however you want me to. Would you rather me appear younger?" And so to me, certain things are actually decided by the other side to make you comfortable. So let's say you're in India or some remote village where they dress differently than in your culture. Well, it's very possible that the person would appear in the regular clothes that they used to wear that you're comfortable with. Why? Even Moody called it a spiritual body, just like the Apostle Paul spoke of a spiritual body. It's kind of like there's a body, there's kind of not a body. You actually see the person, you can talk to them, but it's not a normal fleshly body, okay? But I think they can appear how they want to. So there is some variety. But certain people like Osis and Harrelson, who did a major study of deathbed experiences in the United States, and then a study of deathbed experiences in India, they said, yes, people will sometimes call things different things, but maybe they're really seeing the same thing. For example, you see a being of light. In the United States, you see that being of light and you immediately intuit God. And so you call the being of light God, because that's what you're expecting. Well, if you're in India and you're in that culture and a Hindu, you might call it by the name of one of your gods. But there's no indication to me that they're seeing the multi-armed person that they see in pictures sometimes. They're just seeing what they perceive to be God, and they call them by the name they're used to calling him. Same with Muslims having the experience. They may say, oh, it's Allah. Okay, but I think they're seeing the same thing we're seeing. So there are differences and sometimes in the way they describe them, but I think they could be harmonized. The question is, why is there any similarity at all? If these are hallucinations, we all ought to be seeing wild, crazy stuff on the other side. But it's deceased relatives, it's spiritual beings on the other side, it's God. It's just an astounding similarity, where a pattern where you would expect none.
Yes.
Did you ask another question? Did I miss one?
Yes. No, the one that intrigued me the most was with kids, because I think, I think most adults are suspicious with the testimony of adults. And of course, with kids, they don't tend to have the agendas that adults do, or angles, or, so that's what I find interesting is the testimony of kids. Maybe you could just talk a little bit more about that then, what they do. In terms of, do they also experience out of body? Do the kids kind of also recount, I saw you doing this, I'm fascinated with some of those research you've done on some of the experience of children.
Yes, so research has been done specifically on children. One pediatrician studied, in fact, his first experience was a little girl had drowned in the bottom of a swimming pool and was brought in. They didn't think she was going to live. She'd been out of it for quite a while. And I think it was the second appointment, she actually recovered miraculously. I say miraculously, there wasn't like a healing or something, but she came through. And I believe in the second visit, he wanted to see how this thing happened. Did somebody push her under, or, tell me what. So he said, tell me what happened when you're drowning, when you're at the bottom of the pool. She said, oh, when I met Jesus. And he said, yeah, tell me about that. And she went on to begin talking about how she was outside of her body. She talked to two little boys. She had names for them. She actually went in spiritually to her parents' house and could tell you what the other kids were playing with, what the mom was cooking, all these things. He had never heard of something like this. And so he began to study it, and he went back and interviewed the mom, and she confirmed what they were doing during that time was consistent with what the child said. Everything she said checked out, and it was just quite amazing. Melvin Morse is the one who wrote that book, but other studies have been done on children. One lady who was an academic physician, a pediatric oncologist at Yale, wrote a book on near-death experiences. She considered herself an existentialist, an atheist, and but when she went into practice, she started getting to know her little patients, and seeing them at death brought her to the Lord, and she became a very active Christian at that point. But the children would talk about, they would be excited about dying because they had already been shown often what was going to happen on the other side, and they realized that was superior to what was happening here. Now, if you think about it, children probably typically aren't told they're dying. They don't understand death. They're just, we're going to try to get you better. Everybody talks about the positive, but often these children would come back saying, I say come back, these children would express to their parents that they knew they were going to die, even sometimes when the physicians had said they were going to get well. They really thought they were going to get well. The children would confide in their parents, say, no, I'm not going to get well. I'm going to die, but it's okay. I'm going to be on the other side. I've seen it, and they'd be perfectly at peace. Now, what could cause that peace unless it was something that they so vividly experienced that they would know that leaving their teddy bears, their parents, their home, that they were eager to go. One child was so excited about going to the other side that he said he had been given one of these promise wishes things, you know, they could go to Disney World or whatever. And they said, are you excited about going? He said, well, I'm more excited to go into heaven. And this just became such a reality to them that that Dr. Comp became a believer. She said, there is another side, the more she thought about it. So it's a very powerful thing. And I'd recommend believers to study that as well. Doesn't happen to every child, but to many, a significant amount, it does.
So then that might be the question. Then why is it that some people have these experiences and not others? How would you respond to that then? If it's if we're all spiritual beings and we're all going to die, then shouldn't we all kind of have these experiences? Why isn't this happening to more people?
I'd say the same answer as to why didn't Jesus show his miracles to everybody in the first century? I think he showed them to the people who needed to see them, and he didn't feel a need to go point them out to everyone. Why doesn't God heal everybody if he heals some? I think that some people need to be healed. Some people don't need to be healed. And God, in his gracious, full understanding of the world, knows some people need it and other people don't. I've never had a vision or a near death or deathbed experience in my life. I've never seen one directly. Why not? Well, maybe God knows that I'm the type guy who needs to go in and do the research and share it with others. And if I'd seen it myself, maybe I wouldn't be motivated to do it. So I think he gives the experiences to those who need it. And maybe he gives them to a lot more people than we realize, because again, some people at death are comatose and can't share what they're experiencing. My dad, when he was dying in his last days, I remember he looked at me and he said, it's okay. It's okay. Now he had a stroke and in his prior years, and he couldn't express himself completely, but I've got to wonder if he was having an experience where he was seeing the other side. He didn't want me to worry about him. So he was just saying, it's okay. And maybe I needed to hear that at that time. I think God gives it to the people who needs it. And we can't assume that the act of dying is necessarily the trigger that makes this happen. We don't know what the trigger is, if there's a physical trigger. Maybe it's just something that God decides, or maybe it's a trigger we don't know about.
Okay, excellent. A few questions coming in from our audience here. One question here says, I've read of a few cases of near-death experiences where people experience a sort of all-knowingness. How do we reconcile that with Christianity, where we believe that only God is all-knowing?
Well, when they say they knew everything, I would assume that they kind of mean that as an expression to where it seemed like I knew everything. I knew tons more than I know now, in other words. I do think somehow their minds open up. You know, it says in 1 Corinthians 13, we will see all things clearly as he sees them now. I think our minds do open up on the other side. Some people will say, oh, I used to have, you know, all these questions about why did God allow me this to happen to me, or why was I born into this family? They'll go to the other side and say, when I was over there, I knew all that. They said, now that I'm back here, my mind cannot comprehend those things anymore. But just knowing that it does all make sense gives me peace in this life. So that is something people share. They're able, their minds just open up and expand greatly when they're outside of the limitations of the human brain. I would say only God knows everything, but they just know a ton. And that only, in fact, they just say it's enough. The whole experience is ineffable, which means you can't really explain it. So people will go over and say, over on the other side, there was no time. I was in a timeless, and then they'll say, I can't explain it. And they'll say, oh, it was beautiful. There were these colors that I can't even see today, and I can't really fully explain it. And then they'll say, space was different. I could think of somebody and see them. I could talk to them mind to mind. One little girl said, the mother said, you keep telling me that you've been talking to this person on the other side, but I don't see your mouth moving. How do you do it? And she said, oh, we just talk with our think. And so it seems like on the other side, things are very different. They're ineffable. And probably the best way we can explain that on this side is to say, wow, I could just think of everything. Well, I don't think you're omniscient like God, but it seemed like it when you could understand as much as you could on the other side.
Yeah, it's interesting to say the least. This is
it is interesting.
Yes. Another question: do you believe that a person will be brought back, and God only gives a preview or planned experience, like you said? He is a producer. Do you believe that a person will be brought back, and God only gives a preview or planned experience? Not quite sure what the question is there. Like you said, he is a producer. Does that make any sense to you?
Well, let me just reiterate that I think God is the producer. I also believe that Satan could probably get involved and be a producer. So there are probably going to be false experiences, just like there are true miracles and there are false miracles. There have been true prophecies in the past, but there have been false prophets in the past. So the producer may be Satan, it may be God. Certain ones may be hallucinations that are similar to near-death experiences. But in any science, we don't take the minority. We say that these are anomalies kind of out by the side, but we look at the main experience of what are 90% of the people experiencing. Yes, I believe that God is giving us an experience for his purposes. And I should mention, we haven't talked about this at all, but not all the experiencers are glorious and good. Some are, they kind of ignored this at the beginning. Moody did mention that some of them were negative. They call them hellish experiences or distressing near-death experiences. There are experiences that are hellish, which I don't even like to think about, but people will talk about them. And it is, I don't know, they'll estimate 10 to 15 of the percent of the experiences are that. It may be more, because a physician, Maurice Rawlings, said that somebody had a horrible hellish experience while he was doing resuscitation. The person would keep reviving and then would say, you've got to keep me revived because I'm in hell. And then he would go out, then would come back and he said, you got to keep me alive. And the guy ended up living. But he said months later, or whenever his next appointment was, the person didn't even remember it. And he said, I really think some people that have hellish experiences just put them back in their mind because they don't want to believe them. And so there may be a lot more of them than are reported. But
Yeah,
I would say,
the one.
Go ahead.
By the way, my friend's experience, his experience was one in which he experienced, his near-death experience was one which was negative as well.
Okay.
He was just conscious of tremendous evil and darkness, and he couldn't sleep for 2 weeks afterwards. I would be interested to go back and talk to him and ask him to tell me about that. I'm of course, provided he's open to speaking about it, because I would think that if you've had a terrible experience, you might not be wanting to share that with people or talk about it. If you've had a glorious experience, you might be much more inclined to share that experience with people than the notion that you were just experienced a really terrible thing.
Yeah, you might just ask him if it's okay to talk about it, because some people don't really have anybody they can talk to about these things because they're afraid people will think they're crazy. If you take them seriously and ask them further questions, sometimes they really appreciate it. They need somebody to confide in. I would also say that just because a person is a non-believer doesn't necessarily mean that we would expect a hellish experience. This is not a final heaven, I think, that they're experiencing. This is kind of like you're in the vestibule of heaven. You're on the other side. Often people will come to a point where they'll say, okay, if you go through this gate, or if you go further, you can't come back. Well, that may very well be heaven. The other part where everybody's experiencing, I would say, is the other side, but not necessarily heaven. So a person who is an atheist, a person who's involved in some creepy religion, or whatever, might have a good experience because they need to go and see that God is a God of love. And once they experience that, they become a seeker. And that's when we need to come around and say, hey, let me show you what this looks like from a Christian standpoint. I think that's a great opportunity to help reach them. But, it's the love of God that leads to repentance. Not every non-believer needs to experience hell to get serious about God. A lot of them just need to see Jesus, and they need to see, oh, there's another side and it's beautiful. Well, I'd better come back. And I think typically, biblically, you don't get the gospel shared with you on the other side or in a vision. Whenever we see a vision in the Bible, they're supposed to go talk to so-and-so and get a completed view of it. Muslims often have this happen. They're not given the gospel on the other side. They say, oh, you need to go talk to somebody and you need to seek. So I think a non-believer may very well experience heaven, experience a life review, but it's really just a vestibule to heaven, and it's not an assurance that, hey, everything's okay, you don't have to worry about death.
Okay. And so maybe we can close out with this final question. Two, give me in all the research you've been doing on this topic for the last 10 years, give me 2 accounts of near-death experiences which you researched and you thought, wow, that was a striking experience that really does leave me convinced that there's something rather interesting going on here. Give me your best ofs, kind of. I like when I'm going to interview the archaeology guys and say, give me your top 2 or top 10 best ofs. Give me your best of near-death experiences that you just thought, no, that's a wonderful account, a compelling account.
The first thing I'll say is I really hesitate to do that, because I think the evidence is in the professional studies of multiple experiences. If I go out and say that I agree with this one experience and boy, there's no way to explain that, next thing I know, I'll find out the person's a fraud or somebody, there was something wrong with it, and I hate to put all my trust in any experience, just like any of us would. A scientist looks at multiple experiences that people do not have alternate reasons to share or potential conflicts of interest. They look at the multiple experiences. But let me just mention a couple. Okay, Mark Twain. Mark Twain is often accepted by atheists as being one of theirs. I don't think he ever claimed to be an atheist, but he's certainly kind of a secular guy who liked cutting down organized religion. But one day in his 20s, he had a very vivid dream where he woke up, he was walking out, he thought his brother had died. Now, his brother was in his 20s as well. He was young, they were both working on a riverboat, but he had a very specific dream. He tells about it in his autobiography, and also probably the Nobel Prize or Pulitzer Prize winning writer who wrote his biography tells of it as well. So I don't think he was just making this up, because it was very personal to him. And so Mark Twain talks about he had this dream, very vivid, but it was also very specific. He saw his brother in a casket, a metallic casket. He was wearing Mark's suit, okay, which is unusual. And he had a bunch of flowers on top. I believe it was white flowers with a red one in the middle. It might have been red flowers with a white one in the middle. I'm colorblind, so colors kind of freak me out. So anyway, so he saw all this in his dream. It was so real. He walked outside, and it took him for a while to say, wow, that was a dream. My brother's really not dead. But he said it was so vivid. And so sure enough, I believe it was a few weeks later, maybe a month later, there was a boiler explosion on the riverboat. His brother lived for a little while, but then died. He went to see him, and also the casket was supposed to be set on 2 chairs. So the casket, a metallic casket, was set on these 2 chairs. Many other people died on that riverboat. They were in wooden caskets, but a bunch of ladies had put together money to buy him a nice metal casket. He was in a suit that Mark didn't realize he had let him borrow, and there were these flowers on just like he had seen it. And then a lady, except there wasn't the extra flower, and then a lady came up and put that flower in the middle. Mark Twain said that this was not a naturalistic thing. And people years later said, oh, that happened so many years ago, you probably embellished it and whatever. He said, no, I can see it just like it happened. It was in my mind. So you can actually sit down and kind of calculate the odds of what would be the odds that something that specific, that's called a crisis apparition, which I put in the category of deathbed visions because it's surrounding someone's death. And that was actually studied by some people at Cambridge back in the late 1800s, where they surveyed the 17,000 people and found out that a large percentage had these crisis apparitions. And so you've got the individuals who have these that are very specific. I think it speaks at least against naturalism, okay? And then they studied and found these in large numbers of people. What atheists tend to say is, oh, there are billions of people in the world. Somebody's going to have a really weird dream and it's going to come true out of billions of people. But if you find an incidence of this and find, as they did in the late 1800s, that there were 400 times as many people having these experiences within a 24-hour period of someone dying, 400 times as many as you would expect, then there's something going on here.
Yeah.
Is that one good enough?
Yeah. No, that is interesting. And interesting, it's Mark Twain. I'm familiar with some of his stuff, and that is an interesting, that would have happened to somebody like Mark Twain. Fascinating one, yeah. Well, Steve, look, this has been wonderful. A fascinating topic, a very interesting one, and it's one that I have to think about and do a little bit more research on. And I appreciate your PDF, and I'll share that with others here. And we should like to hear you again on these things. But thank you for all the work you're doing for Russia, Christian America, and all your research. And it's been wonderful to meet you. And thank you for taking some time out to come and talk to us here in South Africa about this. And so God bless you. And we pray the best for you and taking care of your mom. And yeah, we'll keep in touch. But thank you very much. Good evening to you.
Thank you so much for helping people like me who tend to doubt and need answers to those questions.